Hello and welcome to the workshop. I'm D-Man. Today I'll be taking you through a tutorial on how to build modular assets in Maya, which you can then export to the game engine of your choice. What we'll do first is to make sure our grid is set up for our project, and this may differ based on your project. We'll need to click on display, then grid options box to bring up the menu. As you can see here, my grid is set up to specific to the assets I am making and having them represent real world measurements. So the length and width was 1000, spacing every 100 and subdivisions every 10. And this will help us with UV snapping our modular pieces so they align properly. So what I'm doing now is bringing in a reference. So we're using the bipedal character from Maya, and we're just using this to make sure that our sizing is accurate. So what we're going to do now is then create a plane, and that's going to be our first asset. The measurements I'm using are 240 by 240. This is based on the Australian housing system, which is a standard size of a wall, so 240 centimeters is the units of measurement I'm using. We're also going to take the subdivisions down to 1 because we just don't need them. The keys I'm using now to rotate, I'm holding down J, and that'll snap our pivot rotation. And then when you want to change the pivot point itself, we're going to press the D key, hold down V, and then drag it to the vertex we want. Then pressing D again to release that, and that snaps our vertice to the corner we need. You then delete any history and freeze those transformations to reset the axis. I'm then using the X key to then snap it along the grid lines, both in the X, Y or Z. You'll also find these hotkeys listed in the description below. We're going to begin modeling the doorway now, or the piece that we're going to be using for our modular doorway. I'm just using the bipedal character as a reference for the sizing. I'm then going to be using the edge component and then the edge loop tool. Just by holding down the shift and right mouse button, getting to the multi-cut. We're then going to put one down the center, just above its head and either side, and that'll give us the approximation of our doorway. And what I realized just before I cut out everything was the fact that I actually hadn't kept our original plane. So what I've done here is I've just copied and then shifted across the original plane, so we do need that original wall that we created. Now that we've created the copy, we'll go back to the doorway, we'll then select those faces, delete them, and then get rid of that edge that we no longer need either. And then we have it, our basic modular doorway. We'll also go back to our original wall and take out all those edges that we do not need. Again, no subdivisions needed in a basic wall. And what I'm doing now is just making sure that I have deleted all those vertices and there aren't any extras there. I did forget this at the start, and it is great practice to get into, is our naming conventions, making sure we are naming all of our asset pieces and keeping that structure and skill set throughout the entire build. It's a wonderful practice to keep in mind and keep at the forefront of what we're doing. So now that we've done that, I'm going to take another copy and I'm going to split this one directly in half and create ourselves a half wall template. And by deleting the left side of the half, we can then realign our pivot point down to there using those D and V keys again, deleting our history and freezing our transforms, and there we have it, our half wall. We're now just going to duplicate this technique to create ourselves a quarter wall, so the time is sped up for this, just so we're not wasting around repeating the same things over again. Now that the majority of our plain modular pieces are out the way, we're now going to create the start of the bay window. So we're going to create ourselves a cylinder. We're going to size it up to the radius that we need, which is 60, being half of 120. And then we're going to size it at 120 as well. So it's going to create us our cylinder. We're then going to go into our face mode and we're going to delete 3/4 of our cylinder, as we only need 1/4 of it to create a modular asset. So if we use 1/4, flip it around 3 times, we have our full cylinder. It's time to make the rest of our bay window, so we're going to use our plane, we're going to snap it to our grid so it lines up with our rounded cylinder there, our quarter cylinder. Now sometimes this can happen when working with Maya. I've selected both edges, but you'll notice the pivot point is off to the side. So to do this we need to reset our pivot. So we double click on our move tool, just click the reset button and it resets our pivot point. We can then go back to our model, select the edges, hold down our X and shift key at the same time for cloning and moving along the grid, and then snap it to each of those grid boards, snap it to the grid point that we need to finish on. And then we have the middle piece for our bay window. Not to forget our naming conventions, deleting our histories and resetting our transforms. So what we're doing now is creating one of the last pieces for our modular assets, and that is the corner pillar. making sure to use the same sizing convention. So we're doing this at 30 centimeters by 240 by 30 centimeters to make sure it does line up with the modularity of our assets. So to find the center point for this one down the bottom, because we do want the center of our pillar, we're going to use our edge tool, our multi-cut tool, and then we're going to create 2 edge loops in the center. So at 50%, so one on one side, one on the other, and that'll create our vertex right in the middle there at the bottom. And then again, using those same buttons we used before, the D and V for the gizmo and the snapping, and then our X to align it back to the grid. I'm going to create one extra asset here based off of our wall, because we're going to texture that slightly differently when we get to our texturing. So what I'm doing now is selecting them all. I'm going to hold down right mouse button and select assign new material. We're going to just assign a Lambert, and then we're going to assign what we call our trim sheet or cheat sheet. It's one texture, generally in a power of 2. I've chosen 1024 by 1024, and I've created a texture sheet which has all of my textures on the one sheet. Now, as you can see here in my viewport, the materials are showing. If you're seeing it like this and it's all grey, that little checker box I've got my mouse on just there, that's what you'll need to do to show your texture, and the box next to it shows your wireframe. So what we're going to do now is just go through our UV unwrapping. We're going to place all of these onto the UV texture sheet, and then align all our vertices and UV shells up to the correct textures. So I'm just going to speed this along now. It's a fairly basic process. I might share the first one and then we'll speed up the rest. There's a couple of key points I'd like to show you just a bit further on, and we'll get to those in a moment. The basic process I'm using here is just using the UV shell and the UV options. So I've used the UV shell to scale and move my tool, my UV shell around, and then I'm using the UV points to line up with the grid lines there. Grid lines and the texture itself, just to make sure that all of the UV points are as close as they can be without overlapping into the next UV. Now's a great time to hit that bell, the like and subscribe button. Drop a comment below if you liked the tutorial or not, and if there's anything else you'd like to see me do or take on board. So right now we're just quickly going through, as a quick speed unwrap of all the assets we've got. We've got the pillar, we've got the bay window, the doorway, and some windows. In the process of creating modular assets, you can always add more to it. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a window inside our weatherboard here. So again, using the edge tool and the multi-cut function, I'm cutting in some extra edges, and what we're going to do is create ourselves a little window inside our plane. And to do this, once we go into our UV editor, we're going to select those edges around the window area, and we're going to cut them away from our UV plane. We're then going to use the UV shell tool and UV tool, and we're going to line that up with our window texture. The end result will put that window bang smack in the middle of our weatherboard like it's always been there. It's a great way to utilize and maximize differences in UV spacing and unwrapping. So we generally tend to think that we have to texture a window into place, whereas doing it this way here, we can then take our models or our textures and then just unwrap them, cut them away from the original plane and line them up where we need to. This usually only works in square images, so square grids, square lines. It does get a bit tricky when there are curves involved as well, but in the end, there is our finished product, the window inside our plane, and we've just created another modular piece to go with our kit. So here we have all the pieces used to create the asset at the start of the video. As a last minute addition, I decided to create another wall plane, but this time with a door, utilizing the same functions we did when we created the window. So that wraps up the bulk of the tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed watching, and if you hang around, you'll see the speed build of the model asset shown at the start of the video clip.